Welcome back and thank you for staying with us. Now, on the second segment, we will be focusing on an insightful interview granted by Adetunji Omotola, a legal advocate and African thought leader, where he discusses the evolution and importance of the diplomatic relations between Nigeria and South Africa since the end of apartheid. Now, we remember how Nigeria's isolation under General Sani Abacha contrasted sharply with South Africa's post-apartheid emergence led by Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki. Now, strong personal ties between leaders exemplified by the friendship between Obasanjo and Mbeki helped lay the foundation for deep economic cooperation and Pan-African initiatives such as NEPAD, forging robust diplomatic and cultural bonds between the two nations. However, recent years have seen a mix of successes and tensions as incidents like xenophobic attacks have strained people-to-people connections despite cordial government-to-government relations. Now, with both nations playing influential roles on the continent, one must ask, how can Nigeria and South Africa transform past grievances into opportunities for a more resilient and inclusive future together? Now, I'm joined by Adetunji Omotola himself. He's a global affairs analyst, also a legal advocate and African thought leader in Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you so much for joining us at this time, Adetunji.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, in your interview, you described Nigeria-South Africa relations since 1994 as having up and down dynamics. Could you briefly elaborate on how early political legacies, that is, Nigeria under Abacha versus South Africa post-apartheid transformation, shaped these relations?
Yeah, look, the two countries have had a long history. If you remember, Nigeria became an independent nation on the 1st of October 1960. And then in the same year, I believe, in fact, one of the worst massacres in South African history happened also in 1960, the Sharpeville massacre. And because of that massacre, the government of Tafawa Balewa, the first prime minister and the only prime minister that we've had in Nigeria, he was killed. But in 1961, Nigeria broke diplomatic relations with South Africa, and the relations were only restored after the fall of apartheid. And in fact, it was restored 2 months before Nelson Mandela was sworn in as president. So that relationship is only about 31 years old. But of course, when South Africa got its own democracy in 1994, when Mandela was sworn in on the 10th of May, 1994, even though the elections took place on the 27th of April, what then happened was Nigeria was going through its terrible ordeal. Because if you remember, a year before, the former dictator, General Ibrahim Babangida, had annulled the elections, the freest and fairest elections in Nigeria's history, won by Chief Moshood Kashimawo Abiola and his running mate, I believe, Babagana Kingibe. So these elections have been annulled in Nigeria, and that ushered in a period of instability and civil disobedience in Nigeria until Abacha stepped in a few months later in November of 1993. So within 7, 8 months or 6 months, Mandela was sworn in South Africa. Nigeria had a dictator in Abacha who was killing his opponents and seeking to succeed himself. So all that period also coincided with the time that NADECO was formed, the National Democratic Coalition. Many of his leaders fled the country. That was when they killed Alfred Rwani, they killed Yaradua, the former number 2 to Obasanjo during the military era. They also killed Kudirat Abiola and kept Abiola in jail, where he later died a few days or a few weeks, about 4 weeks after Abacha died in prison. Of course, Saro Wiwa was also hung to death, along with 8 others. They called them the Ogoni 9. So Abacha's era, those 5 years while he was president of Nigeria, military head of states, and South Africa had Mandela, the contrast could not have been more glaring. Here we had in South Africa a global icon. Somebody had forgiven those who kept him in prison for 27 years, and they were talking about a rainbow nation, reconciliation, and even had a government of national unity. The first government was a government of national unity with the National Party, who jailed Mandela and the likes of Sisulu and even Thabo Mbeki's father in Robben Island for almost 3 decades. So the contrast was very, very sharp. And of course, at that time, Nigeria had become a pariah nation, and Nigeria was even sacked from the Commonwealth because of the killing of the Ogoni Nine. And so that really, especially Ken Saro-Wiwa. So that was the background of the relationship at the early stages of South Africa's new development.
Adetunji, you also did mention, that approximately in 31 years, of this relationship, that approximately 40 treaties, have been signed between the two nations. Could you highlight a few key agreements that have had the most impact, in fostering economic cooperation between these two nations?
Well, look, we've got first of all, the treaties then led to the creation of the Binational Commission. The Binational Commission is basically the architecture that the two countries are using to give expression to the treaties that have been signed, whether it's in defense, because we have a defense attaché here at the High Commission, whether it's in education, whether it's the bilateral air services agreement that allows Air Peace to be able to come in here and pick up passengers. I believe that was signed in 2019 after the xenophobic attacks when former President Muhammadu Buhari visited on a state visit. They signed the BASA agreement, which gave expression in the airline space. There's a lot of collaboration, even in oil and gas, even as you know, in telecoms. MTN is in Nigeria, even in the banking sector. You have Stanbic Bank, you have your DSTV, there's airlines, South African Airways is flying into Lagos, there's South African tourism, there's the diplomatic corps in Abuja, there's the High Commission in Abuja, and the Consul General in Lagos. And we also have the same here. You have the consulate in Johannesburg and the High Commission in Pretoria. So there's a host of collaborations, but the challenge is that it tilts more towards the South African side. There are more than 120 South African companies doing business in Nigeria. In South Africa, we can only see Dangote and of late Access Bank. Even Access Bank is very small compared to the big four, or if you like, if you add Investec, the big five. So Nigeria is not really doing much in terms of scale, economies of scale. There are no Nigerian shops here. There are hardly any Nigerian brands, the likes of Innocent, brands like even Boniki and so on. You wouldn't find them here. TomTom, all the brands that we grew up loving, you don't see them here. And there are thousands of Nigerians here, but our products are not visible in South African shops. But the converse is true in Nigeria, where you have your ShopRite and Spar, you have many hotels in South Africa. So it is still skewed towards the South African side. These treaties need to be, there should be reciprocity, basically.
Yeah, there should be a balance. Well, now still talking about that, you mentioned a bit about the xenophobic attack, and we're seeing a lot of that happening, against Nigerians as well in South Africa. They've repeatedly strained people to people-to-people ties. Now, what measures have been taken by both governments to address these xenophobic issues and also to restore confidence among, Nigerian communities abroad, especially those in South Africa?
Look, I've got to be very honest with you. I think the factors that drive xenophobia, the real issues that lead to xenophobic attacks on foreigners, whether they're Zimbabweans, whether they're Nigerians, Malawians, Somalis, and so on, or Mozambicans, because rarely do Nigerians die from xenophobic attacks. Maybe sometimes, you will get the odd mob who will attack a Nigerian, stone them to death, or the police brutality that will lead to death. But Nigerians haven't had the same heavy dose of killings as your Zimbabweans, for example. But look, I think the fundamental thing that drives xenophobia in South Africa is the fact that, firstly, there's a high level of unemployment in South Africa. There's a lot of also high level of unskilled local people who are not very well educated and skilled. And as a result of that deficiency, there's a gap that is met by, if you like, foreign nationals, as they call them, people who are ready to work longer hours, sometimes for less pay, and that agitates the locals who will blame foreign nationals for stealing their jobs. Also, sometimes it could be accusations that foreign nationals, especially the Nigerian example, are stealing their women. Also, sometimes it could be the fact that they would say that foreign nationals, in the case of Nigeria, are selling drugs to their people and is affecting their children. So these are very serious matters. And I don't think the government has really moved the needle because unemployment is still very high. Youth unemployment is high. There's a lot of young people who are taking drugs. And some of these crimes that are alleged have not gone away. So it's very difficult not to have these reactions from the locals. Even when they complain, nothing is done by government. So, and also I talk about institutional xenophobia, the same way that you have institutional racism. So there are some, for example, the police, they need to be educated more about non-South Africans and how they carry on, in the community, in their community, rather than over-policing them and over-brutalizing them in some instances that leads to the death of young men. And we've lost too many young men in our community. So I don't think the government is very serious about it. When the attacks happen, everybody will have a view. But once the attacks die down, it's back to normal. Even stations were all good. Everybody is fine again until another wave happens. So I suppose it's consistent with the way that we deal with matters in many African states. We're not very serious about change.
Yeah. We're actually about wrapping up this segment right now, Adetunji. So I would love to hear your final thoughts after all that you have said and how you think that the future leadership transitions in both Nigeria and South Africa would influence the trajectory of their bilateral relations, especially in light of emerging challenges like economic inequality and also shifting geopolitical alliances.
Yeah, look, I think there are many positives. But firstly, I must say to you, I'm very concerned that President Ahmed Bola Tinubu, since being sworn into office on the 29th of May, 2023, almost 2 years to that day, we don't have, well, for over a year now, we don't have any ambassador for Nigeria in any country, anywhere on earth. So all the ambassadors who are there, they're probably acting. People who have been moved up, maybe one notch, so they're acting, so they have no letters of credence. So there isn't any real value. We don't really have any diplomatic weight at the moment under this current president, because we don't have any ambassadors. Now, in terms of where we can get low-hanging fruits, the fact that there are so many Nigerians abroad and we contribute extensive amount of money. I mean, it's even almost bigger than the federal budget, about $30 billion or so. Yeah. And then you have Nigerians who cannot vote. That's an indictment on our democratic experiment or democratic order. But now, in terms of the positive aspects, is that that's a huge chunk of Nigerians outside that the government can leverage their skill sets and begin to use them to begin to build stronger relationships with the countries where those Nigerians are. Even in terms of trade, those Nigerians are also a ready market for made in Nigeria products, which can then be used to expand trade, because there are many Nigerians in China, in Guangzhou, in London, in some areas of London. Nigerians are actually quite sizable in the south of London. areas like Peckham and all of those areas, but we haven't really seen any diplomatic economics on the part of our government to be able to leverage these skills that we've got. Even made in Nigeria exhibitions should be the darling of the world. Everywhere where Nigerians are, the government should be doing made in Nigeria exhibitions in those communities, and by extension, it will grow globally. So I think those are low-hanging fruit. Use your people. It's all about people.
Yeah, definitely. Well, with that, I think we've come to a wrap on this discussion. But thank you so much, Adetunji Omotola, Global Affairs Analyst in Johannesburg, for your time and also for speaking to us on the relationship between Nigeria and South Africa. And I do hope and wish that they take, each other more seriously, and we move past whatever, whatever it is that we have holding us back.
Thank you very much.
And that's where we draw the curtains today on The Conversation. You can watch News Central live on DSTV channel 422, Go TV channel 23, Star Times channel 274, Avo TV, and YouTube. Thank you. I am Darshan Usman. Have a wonderful evening.